alcoholic. Since it's family night, I'll tell my family joke. I don't have many. But this lady was talking to a friend, and she said, my husband and I, we have the best relationship. In fact, we go out to dinner twice a week. I go on Tuesdays, he goes on Thursdays. I don't know about you, but one of the things that this disease completely removed from my life, when I got sober, there was nothing funny in life. Everything was serious. And there's a proverb that says a merry heart is like a good medicine, so when we can laugh, that's good for our health. And so we need to find things to laugh about. And in the seriousness of this disease, there's still some good things in life. And when we have that merriment on the inside, it will help us to heal. But tonight we're going to take a look at a prayer that I'm sure you're all familiar with by now, called the Serenity Prayer. My belief is everyone journeys through life wants to find some peace. Peace of mind, peace in here. And many of us have gone down a lot of different roads trying to find that. I grew up in a home that was pretty chaotic. It was before the term dysfunctional family became popular. We certainly fit that criteria. A lot of arguing, fighting, screaming. Words like happiness, serenity, peace, they were just words, didn't mean a whole lot. And when I was 15, I took my first drink of alcohol, and for me it was absolute magic that day. I had never felt that way in my entire life. All my sense of inadequacy, inferiority, insecurity just disappeared. I felt confident. I felt like I could take on the whole world. It was magic. And what alcohol did for me that day was it gave me a counterfeit serenity. It gave me a counterfeit confidence. It wasn't the real deal, but I settled for that for the next 16 years. It would do for me what nothing else would do. And I ended up in the rooms of AA when I was 31, beaten down by this disease of alcoholism. I'll never forget my first meeting. The person chairing the meeting said, we're going to open this meeting with a moment of silence followed by the Serenity Prayer. And my initial response to that statement was panic. Oh man, I got in a room with a bunch of religious fanatics. But by the time they had concluded saying that prayer, that sense of panic was gone. I thought that sounds kind of neat. And since that time, the prayer has become a real important part of my journey. I have some peace of mind today. Peace in here. I'm real grateful for that. And so we'll kind of break the prayer apart, look at some key words in it. And my hope is that this prayer becomes an important part of your journey. It was written by a guy named Reinhold Niebuhr. He was a German theologian. In 1941, it appeared in a New York newspaper in an obituary. An AA member saw it, took it to the meeting, and began opening that meeting with the first 4 lines of the prayer. The Serenity Prayer in its entirety is much longer than what we open meetings with, and I have a packet of information for you after this session that has the entire Serenity Prayer. And from that beginning, that prayer began spreading throughout the U.S. in the AA circles and eventually worldwide. 10 years ago, I was in a place called Izhevsk, Russia, city of 850,000 people. 1 AA meeting a week in that city, but they opened it with the Serenity Prayer. So I believe it's pretty universal. We all want to find some peace. So we'll look at some key words, kind of break it apart. God, grant me the serenity. If I eliminate the first word of the first line, it becomes incomplete. Grant me the serenity is kind of empty. If I say, God, grant me the serenity, that means I've come to somewhere in my belief system of God, higher power, higher spirit. Some Native Americans will say grandfather. It's an understanding there's something greater than me. There's something bigger than me. And some people start this journey from a position of atheism, agnosticism, doubt, all different kinds of backgrounds. But what I've observed is no matter where a person starts, if they stay on the path, they come to some sense that there's something greater than them. And when that happens, you can say this prayer, know it will be heard, know it will be responded to. The second word of the prayer, grant. Well, the word grant has two usages. One that's synonymous with give, but there's also another usage. For example, a welfare grant, an educational grant, a government grant. Those kind of grants have conditions. You apply for an educational grant, you fill out the paperwork, meet all the conditions, they say, here it is. If you don't meet the conditions, they say, sorry, it's not available to you. And what I believe is there's such a thing as a grant of serenity, and what I need to find out, what are the conditions? What needs to be in place in order for me to find this thing we call serenity? For example, if I have a big old resentment just kind of boiling on the inside, do you think it's possible to have serenity at the same time? Never worked for me. If that resentment is active, serenity is just a word. And the word resent comes from a Latin word resentare, which means to re-feel. Something happens, we begin to re-feel it. Maybe initially it was a little resentment, but after re-feeling it for days, weeks, months, sometimes years, that resentment kind of takes on a life of its own. The book Alcoholics Anonymous has a couple interesting things to say about resentment. On page 64 it says, resentment is the #1 offender. It destroys more alcoholics, I'll add addicts to that, than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. And then on page 66, it says, it is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic addict, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit, the insanity of our alcohol or drugs returns, and we drink or use again. And with us, to drink or use is to die. I could tell you many stories of people I've known who have started this journey we call recovery, and they begin to pick up a few resentments along the way, and maybe old resentments that haven't been resolved, and pretty soon we hear, old Joe, he went back out. Always hate to hear that. But there's one story that's always just stuck with me. This happened some years ago in Salem. A young man came to a 7 a.m. meeting. They had this meeting, well, they still have it, Monday through Friday, 7:30 on Saturday. He came in the meeting because of his alcoholism. His life was a train wreck. And he liked what he heard and became a regular attender at that meeting. He was around for a little while, and he took on a service position at the meeting. He would get there early in that particular meeting. They have greeters, and he was a greeter. And a little while later, he took on another service position. He would show up early and help set up the meeting, make coffee, put out chairs, books, and hang around afterwards and help put things away. He got a sponsor. Began journeying through the steps. Celebrate a year of sobriety. That's a big deal. By the time he celebrated 2 years, he was sponsoring people. He was one of the first to reach out to the newcomer who came in the door. His life was really coming together. And then at a business meeting, some members proposed changing the format of the meeting. It had always been just an open discussion meeting, and he was opposed to that idea, as were others, but in AA, those kind of things come up, and the group votes, and the group conscience dictates the direction of the group, and they voted to change the format of the meeting, and he got resentful. And it wasn't long before he stopped coming to the meeting. Before 6 months had passed, we heard that he had gone back out again. And before another 6 months had passed, they found him dead in his apartment. He had drank himself to death, 39 years old, a professor at a university. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. And stories like that tell me I need to find a healthy spiritual way of dealing with resentments that can come up on a daily basis. I learned some real unhealthy ways growing up. Get even. Someone get you, get them back before you get them worse than they got you. That's just the way life works. I've slashed tires, broken windows, keyed cars, character assassination. When someone offended me in some way, my agenda was, you're going to pay. And always had a sense of satisfaction when I got even, but never any freedom. My belief about this recovery journey that we talk about is about more and more freedom as we stay on the path. What I began learning in the rooms of AA, that this higher power that I was having some understanding of wanted to work in my life in such a way that I would forgive others. If I have a resentment against someone in New York City, it's like a chain between me and that person. Every time I think of him or her, that chain gets yanked tight. I do an emotional dance. They're probably not even aware. I'm losing sleep. When I forgive that person, that chain gets broken, and I can come to that understanding, but my experience has been sometimes to get to a place of forgiveness is a journey in itself. Some offenses that have happened against some people have been horrendous. We see it in the news every day, the awful things that people do to people. And some things we say, well, how could anyone ever possibly forgive that offense? And I know for me, there were times when I've prayed, God, create a willingness in me to forgive. I know I should, I know I would benefit, but there's part of me doesn't want to do that. And so I ask for that willingness, and at some point it comes in, and then forgiveness happens, and then what follows that is freedom. There's a guy named Lewis Smedes wrote a book titled The Art of Forgiving, and I'll share some of his thoughts. You can read the rest of them later. Definition of forgiveness: 1, to give up resentment. 2, pardon, absolve. 3, to grant relief from payment of. 4, allowing room for error or weakness. And he writes, forgiving someone who wronged us does not mean that we tolerate the wrong. Forgiving does not mean that we excuse the person who did it. Forgiving does not mean that we invite someone who has hurt us once to hurt us again. Forgiving does not mean that someone is let off the hook. It means we are. Forgiving is a way we can be fair to ourselves. Forgiving does not mean that we are doormats. When we forgive, we set a prisoner free and discover that the prisoner we set free is ourselves. And someone else wrote, I don't know who the author of this is, he said, God invented forgiveness because not even he can change the past. Guilt and shame aren't exactly the same, but they kind of feel the same. If I violate a value that I have, I feel guilty, should feel guilty. There are institutions full of people who have no capacity to access any sense of guilt, no matter what they do. So if you violate a value that you have and you get that little punch of guilt, that's a good sign. Guilt says, I've done something wrong. Shame, on the other hand, says, I am wrong. It's an indictment on my entire being. I grew up in a home where shame was kind of used as a weapon. Shame on you. You should be ashamed of yourself. And the words that would follow those statements, by the time they were concluded, it was no longer about what I had done. It was about this terrible, awful person I was. And there was a cycle in my life that I had a difficult time understanding. It was a cycle of sabotage. Started school, got up to 8th grade graduation, and there was this big meeting, the principal, teachers, parents. And what the school was recommending was that I repeat the 8th grade. class clown, acted out a lot, in and out of the principal's office. And I did my best act of contrition and sorrow and all this, and moaned and groaned and pleaded and cried. And finally they said, yeah, okay, we're going to let you graduate. You get to go to high school. Well, this was in a little town down on the coast. It's not even a town any longer. It was Empire, Oregon. It's part of Coos Bay now. In our graduating class, I had probably 26, 27 kids, and I went from there to Marshfield High School, which is substantially larger. And I thought, well, they've given me a break. They've given me a chance. I've got to make this work. And at the end of my freshman year, I received this big signed certificate from the Torch Honor Society. I was an honor student. My parents were proud of me. I was proud of myself. I'd accomplished something. Prior to the end of my sophomore year, I was called into the principal's office, and he said 3 miles away, North Bend High School, I strongly recommend you go there next year. What he was saying was, buddy, you come back here, you're dead meat. And my sophomore year and freshman year was like two different people. Two different people. All the old behaviors came back that sophomore year. So I went to North Bend, barely made it through the junior year. And at the beginning of my senior year, it became evident that I wasn't going to be able to get enough credits to graduate. And by this time, I had juvenile authorities involved in my life, 2 minor in possession charges, drunk driving. I started school when I was 5, so at the beginning of my senior year of high school, I was only 16. But back in the 50s, oftentimes what they did with guys like me is they would put us in the military. And their standards are much higher today. But back then, the idea was it'll make them or break them. And so the day I was 17, I said, I will, I do, I surrender. I don't remember the words, but I know I was in the U.S. Navy. I had sabotaged my education. So I got in the Navy and I thought, well, I'm going to make this work. And I was a good sailor. Within 2 years, I had risen in rank to E5, which is second-class petty officer. I was an engineman. I was placed in charge of my own engine room on a ship, had a crew of men working for me. Barely 19 years old. Life had never been better. I saw myself as a career man. I'm going to stay here forever. And a year and a half later, after spending 3 months in a lockdown psych unit at Tripler Army Hospital in Honolulu, I was discharged. I became a cutter. For those of you who don't know, that's about self-mutilation, cutting, burning with cigarettes. Underneath that was alcohol. Came out into civilian life. I had sabotaged this great, promising career. Get out into civilian life, and this cycle of sabotage continued. Every time I would have any kind of success at all, I would sabotage it. And when I got sober, I wondered, why do I do that? Makes no sense. There's a guy named John Bradshaw wrote a book, Healing the Shame That Binds You. And his premise is a lot of people have a shame-based identity or a core of shame on the inside without an awareness of that, but it profoundly affects how they live life. I read his book and I identified with so much of what was in there, and I realized I have that shame-based identity, and one of the characteristics of a person who has that is sabotage. You see, success didn't line up with what was on the inside, but failure did. And while I even have an awareness of it, when I'd reach these levels of success, I would get the ball rolling to bring about the failure because that lined up with who I was on the inside. And my higher power through the recovery journey began changing that core, that identity, and the sabotage stopped. But one of the things I discovered was this forgiveness that I talk about that we extend out there. Need to come back this way too. I can believe in a forgiving God. I can believe that everyone I've ever offended in my life has forgiven me, but if I don't forgive myself, I'm still living my life under a cloud of unforgiveness, and that will affect how I live life. And I struggled with this idea of forgiving myself. I talked to my sponsor, Hugh, after a meeting one night. I said, Hugh, I just can't seem to forgive myself. And he gave me an assignment. He said, when you go home tonight, I want you to go to a mirror. I want you to look yourself in the eyes and say, Gary, I forgive you. And in my mind, I'm thinking, that's one of the dumbest things I've heard so far. How's that going to help? But I went home, made sure my wife was in another part of the house, kind of snuck into the bathroom. And when I got in there, I found myself looking at the floor. The shame was so great. But after a while, I raised my head, I looked myself in the eyes, I said, Gary, I forgive you, absolutely nothing happened, but Hugh said, you keep repeating it till you mean it. And so I began to repeat it. And I don't know if I said it 10, 15, or 20 times. I know this, the last time I said it, I had these big tears coming down my cheeks. And I realized at that moment of time, I had finally forgiven myself for all that stuff back there that I felt so awful about. It was a real turning point for me. Fear, worry, and anxiety aren't exactly the same, but they're close cousins. Grew up with a big black ball of fear on the inside, and my job was not to let anyone know I was afraid. So I was an aggressive kid, acted out a lot, but underneath that was just a tremendous amount of fear. During World War II, I had a new stepdad in my life, and he was in the Navy, and the Navy sent him up to Washington for a short period of time, and Mom went with him, and my sister and I moved in with an aunt and uncle while they were gone. Well, as a small child, I was afraid of the dark. And so my aunt, in order to break me of my fear of the dark, she locked me in a closet. And I remember the terror that I felt in that place. Her intentions were good, but her methods were not effective. And I remained afraid of the dark until I was 16 years old. It was a dark, dark secret in my life. I knew I shouldn't be afraid, but I was absolutely terrified of the dark. And sometime when I was my 16th year, it disappeared. I don't know why, it just was gone. But for 16 years, it was like a giant. And then worry. Worry, worry, worry. Head hit the pillow at night and kick into what I call the worry gear. Start running and racing. Terrible scenarios of what might happen tomorrow, next week. A small child doing this. You know, little kids supposed to be having fun, enjoying life. I was a worrier. And now that fear and worry just was almost this constant state of anxiety. The Big Book uses the term feeling of impending doom. It was like a cloud over my life as a small child. Carry that up into adult life. Into the rooms of AA. Head hit the pillow at night, same thing, running and racing. Just on and on. And I talked to Hugh about it, and I said, Hugh, I can't go to sleep at night. I go to bed and my head just starts taking off on me. I can't stop it. Well, when I was 15 and discovered alcohol, I found a way to sleep. Alcohol was my sleep aid right from the beginning. And the nights I was under the influence, I slept. The nights I wasn't, I didn't. And I get sober and I don't have this alcohol, and I just lie there. It seemed like forever sometimes. Oftentimes get up in the morning just as tired as when I went to bed, with all that worry, fear, and anxiety. So I talked to Hugh, and I said, I've asked God to remove it. It's no better. If anything, it's gotten worse. And he said, well, maybe you need to change the way you pray. And I said, what do you mean? He said, rather than ask God to remove all that, ask God to increase your faith. He said the natural result of more faith will be less fear, worry, and anxiety. I thought about that, and I thought, well, what I'm doing isn't working. I'll give that a shot. So I began praying that way. About 25 years ago or so, my wife and I made a decision that when we retired, we wanted to be as healthy as we could be. So we were living in Salem at the time. We joined a gym, started working out. Well, faith to me is like a muscle. In order for a muscle to stay toned or to grow, it needs resistance. And so we joined this gym to get in shape, and we've consistently done that for 25 or so years. It's just part of our lifestyle. But how effective do you think it would be to go to that gym and go in that room with all those free weights and just look at them? Wow, nice looking weights. Go right on by them into the next room with all the cable machines and Nautilus equipment and say, wow, if I use that, it would probably do this muscle group, and this would probably do this, and walk right on by them into the next room with the ellipticals, Stairmasters, treadmills, rowing machines. Think, boy, I bet those cost a lot of money. And then go sit in the sauna for 20 minutes. That gym's not going to do me a bit of good. In order for a muscle to stay toned or to grow, it needs a resistance. And in the spiritual recovery journey, life is the gym. And it's those places of adversity, those places of fear, those places of worry, those places of disappointment, places of adversity. All of those things are the weights. And what I began to learn was that if I go through those places that I used to drink at, if I go through those places, on the other side, my faith will be a little stronger. And that's proven to be true for me. I drank at adversity. The idea of going through that was a new concept. And slowly, that faith began to grow. And when I was sober 6+ years, this theory of mine about faith growing was really tested. I got a call from my brother-in-law early in the morning. And he said, Gary, I have some bad news. And I said, what's going on? He said, Jeff's dead. Jeff was my younger brother. He died in this disease. He was 26, separated from his wife, 4-year-old son, 11-month-old daughter. Faith had grown in those 6+ years that when that call came, there was no thought of numbing, running, drinking. It just wasn't there, just an understanding of going through that most difficult place for our family. And there was a day in my life, everything was an excuse to drink. Everything. A sunny day, that'd work. A rainy day, oh, that's a great one. Mondays, Tuesdays, everything was a reason or excuse to drink. And this call comes in, I get this information, that thought's just not there. So faith had grown. I had a dilemma. Part of me, at some level, understood that alcohol is slowly removing everything of value in my life. But on the other hand, I could not imagine not having it. Couldn't imagine it. And so developed this elaborate denial system to cover up that thought that maybe alcohol is a problem. And within that denial system was a tremendous amount of dishonesty with myself. Rationalization, justification, blaming. It was always someone else's fault. I'll give you my example of denial. I don't carry a comb. This is for illustrative purposes. But if I was talking to you and say, hey, just a minute, I got something I need to take care of, and I pull it out, You'd think, boy, that guy's got some serious denial going. We can laugh about that, but the denial system that I put around the drink, if someone on the outside could see it just as clearly as you could see that example. But it didn't do me any good for everyone else to see it. I had to see it. Going to meetings, meeting with a sponsor, reading the books, the denial system began to break down. Poor me. Poor me. Pour me a drink. Is the way it goes sometimes. Woe is me, life isn't fair, I never got the breaks. I lived that way for a long, long time. And it was real easy to slip right into the victim role. Everyone's doing it to me. And I believed that for a long time. One day I was really feeling sorry for myself, and I decided to call up Hugh and tell him my tale of woe one more time. And his wife Margaret answered the phone. She said, well, Hugh's not here. And I said, well, and I thought, well, I know Margaret pretty well. I'll just tell her my tale of woe. So I began to unload. And she let me go on for 10, 15 seconds, and she interrupted me, and she said, Gary, I'm real busy right now, but I'll tell you what. Tomorrow I'll set aside 15 minutes and feel sorry just for you. And she hung up the phone. I'm laughing now. I was not laughing then. Hugh used to say she had a black belt in Al-Anon, and I really believe that. And for years, I believed the reason I couldn't find any peace or happiness because things of life out there just wouldn't line up. My belief was if I can get all my ducks in a row, get everything out there just so, life will be wonderful. Have some happiness, have some peace. And with that belief system in place, it turned me into a control freak. I just tried to manipulate and control everything out there. What I began to learn through this prayer is the giants aren't out there at all, they're in here. It's my resentments. It's my guilt and shame. It's my fear, worry, and anxiety. It's my denial. It's my dishonesty. It's my self-pity. It's me slipping into that victim role. It's my anger. It's my jealousy. And what I believe is that every person needs to go inside and get real honest and say, what are my giants? What are my giants? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Acceptance doesn't mean that something that's happened is right or okay. It may not be. What acceptance is, something's happened, I can't undo it. I can't make it different. When a child is born, their area of acceptance of any kind of discomfort is just about nothing. When that baby wakes up in the crib, is hungry, needs a diaper change, does not lie there thinking, well, I'll wait 10, 15 minutes before I let someone know I'm in trouble. You know it right now, it does not hesitate. By the time that child is, say, 6 years old, this will have grown some. Johnny comes in from playing, Mom, I'm hungry. Mom says we're going to be eating dinner in 10, 15 minutes. He doesn't get what he wants when he wants it, but it's just not a deal. Just not a deal at all. So that has grown some. My belief is this should grow throughout my lifetime. I know people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, hard things of life come, and they don't seem to get hooked. Chances are they weren't always that way. Some people refer to this as emotional maturity. Something, perhaps an event would happen at age 40 and it just grabs you, and the same thing happened at 50 and a different response to it because of the change, the growth that is happening. And for me, this stopped growing when I was 15 and picked up my first drink of alcohol. For the next 16 years, alcohol was my buffer with life. Had very little opportunity to mature emotionally because alcohol was in the mix. I was 31 when I got sober, wife, two daughters, scared to death. I saw people my age, they were dealing with life a lot better than I was. It was a marked difference. And my sponsor, Hugh, one night we were talking and he said, Gary, some people grow up, some people grow old. Which way do you want to do it? And boy, he looked right into my soul when he said that. And I realized the immaturity of my life, and I wanted to become a responsible adult. I wanted to be able to deal with hard things of life like I saw other people dealing with them, because I was such a reactor at that time. I had a great example of acceptance first year I was sober down in Coos Bay. And the Episcopal Church on Wednesday night, we had an AA and an Al-Anon meeting, AA upstairs, Al-Anon downstairs, and we had a couple, Glenn and Mamie. He was AA, she was Al-Anon. Almost every Wednesday night they were at the meeting. A week or so prior to this one particular Wednesday night, they'd bought a big, white, brand new four-door Buick, biggest Buick made that year. White leather upholstery. Every option that Buick offered was on that car. 8-track. I think the steering wheel was about that big. Those were huge cars back then. They parked in front of the church that night, went into the meeting. When we came out of the meeting, embedded in the back of their brand new Buick was a beat up old Chevrolet. The driver's side door was open. The driver was gone. Glenn went over and looked at it, went in the church, found a phone, called the police, came back outside, and they just kind of stood around and chit-chatted, waiting for the police to get there. And I'm watching him. I'm wondering, why isn't he going nuts? Why isn't he ranting and raving? He was not paying any attention to that brand new car. Puzzled me. And later on, I called Glenn and said, Glenn, there's something I want to talk to you about. And he and Mamie lived about 3 blocks from my wife and I. At that time, we lived in North Bend. And I walked up to his house one afternoon. He invited me in. He said, well, what do you want to talk about? I said, the other night, your brand new car got smashed. The driver left the scene. You didn't seem to be upset. I don't understand that. He said, well, there wasn't anything I could do about it. He said, when I first saw it, I was angry. But I decided to go to acceptance rather than resentment. And I thought, you mean you've got a choice? That would have never occurred to me. I'd have been a lunatic. Glenn was coming up on his 13th year of sobriety at that time, and that area of acceptance had grown to the place when that event happened, he did not get hooked by it. And he was explaining this to me, and in my mind, I'm praying, God, I want some of that in me. I want some of that in me. Well, sometime later, because of sobriety, Patsy and I were able to buy the nicest car we had ever owned. It was used. For us, it was low mileage, had under 40,000 miles. It was a 67 Chevrolet Impala, 2-door hardtop, blue-green, 327 V8, automatic transmission, power steering, AM radio, great big steering wheel, no dings inside or out. I loved driving that car. Loved driving that car. Well, we heard about this restaurant up the coast in the town of Reedsport, and we thought we'd check it out. And we drove up there one night and parked in front of the restaurant and went in and had a great meal, came outside, and I said to Patsy, didn't we park our car right there? It was gone. So we went inside, and there was a hostess, and I said, did you see someone drive off with a blue-green Chevrolet parked right in front? And she says, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. They'd probably been drinking in the bar, because when they took off up the highway, they were really moving. And I said, well, that was our car. Where's the phone? In the bar. Patsy and I went in the bar, and I told the bartender what happened, dialed the police, handed me the phone. I gave a report. We went over and sat in a booth, and they brought us a cup of coffee while we were waiting. And while I was sitting in that booth, it dawned on me, I wasn't going nuts. I remembered back to that prayer, God, I want some of that in me. And it was there. It was just there. We never did get the car back. It was never recovered. But that incident helped me to see that something was changing on the inside. I knew I was not the author of that change. And although it was a big loss, in the spiritual journey, it was a big gain because I could see something's going on the inside. Authority, I may force someone to do something my way. I may manipulate them in some way. I can't make anyone else different. I want to be accepted as I am, not as I could be, should be, ought to be, want to be. As I am. Cracks, flaws, shortcomings, mistakes. So if I want to be accepted as I am, I believe everyone wants to be accepted as they are. This is a true story. Two Italian sculptors, Donatello and Michelangelo, contemporaries. Donatello had ordered a 3-ton block of marble, and in those days they would move these big blocks of marble on log rollers, and it was hard physical work, and they get it up to his studio. He examines it with the help of the sun, and he looks into it and sees a lot of cracks, flaws, imperfections, and so he rejected it. He says, I can't use this. The workers were disappointed. It was a long way back to the quarry, so they talked it over, and one said, well, Michelangelo isn't too far from here. He's a little absent-minded. Let's run it by his studio. Maybe he won't remember he didn't order it. It's a true story. So they did. They get it up there, and he hadn't remembered, and he examined it the same way that Donatello had. He saw all the same imperfections, but he accepted that block of marble. And out of it created what is considered one of the world's greatest art treasures, the statue of David. And my belief is our higher power looks down on our cracked, flawed lives with all our mistakes and imperfections, will never, ever reject us and would say, I can work with that. One day at a time, I can work with that. I can't change other people, but what I can do one day at a time is grow in my acceptance of others for who they are, where they are in their life's journey. And if I practice that and work at that one day at a time, well, actually what it frees me to do is work on my side of the street. I can get out of other people's business. I got enough stuff on my side of the street to take care of. And I know in the relationship with my wife and I, that profoundly affected our relationship. When I got out of her business and she got out of mine. And what it did was it freed me to look at my side of the street. I don't know about you, but I have a rebellious, defiant, spoiled little snot on the inside. And when someone starts pointing their finger and says, you have to, he stands up. But when they're not pointing the finger, then I've got to take a look. And it profoundly affected the relationship that my wife and I, as we continue to work on the accepting each other as each of us are, not as we would want each other to be. Little Johnny's in the first grade. Recess. Expectation is when the bell rings, all the students file into the classroom and sit at their desks. Well, the bell rings, they all file into the classroom, and they all sit at their desks. Everybody but Johnny stands by his desk. Teacher looks across the room and says, "Johnny, sit down." He looks at her, says, "No." Something happened at recess, he's packing an attitude. "Johnny, sit down." "No." The teacher goes over to Johnny, puts her hands on his shoulders, firmly seats him at his desk and says, "Now sit down." And he looks up at her and says, "I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside." Guess what? We think we've changed someone else. They're probably standing up on the inside. This is just a guess, but I would guess that everyone in this room has stood up on the inside a time or two. I know I certainly have. And I cannot change the way life works. Life is what it is. Book Alcoholics Anonymous talks about accepting life on life's terms. And my experience has been sometimes life's terms stink. And I think that's true for everybody. There will be times when life's terms stink. I cannot do anything about that. Life is what it is. I can't change life, but I can begin growing in my acceptance of life on life's terms. After the death of my brother, his wife raised those kids, and when my niece was 19, she met a guy, and they later got married, had a son. 3 years later, had a second son. When her oldest son was 8 years old, he was diagnosed with what they call soft tissue cancer in this part of his body. He was admitted to Legacy Emmanuel Children's Cancer Ward in Portland for treatment. His first run of chemo was 5 days of it, and at the end of 5 days, he was bald. And they lived in Warrenton at the time, and he'd go home. They'd go home for a week and come back in for a day of chemo, home for a week, chemo, home for a week, chemo, home for a week, and back in and be 5 days of chemo again. And this went on for a period of time, and then they stopped chemo and went to radiation. Well, the radiation, they had some side effects from it. It caused, I don't understand medical terms, but they use the term nesting. It's something to do with scar tissue in the intestine, and it blocked him up, and they had to do abdominal surgery. They get that nesting out, then it would come back. Then they went back to chemo, and sometime during his 9th year of life, he died. That stinks. That's not fair. But that's life. And there's no amount of drugs or alcohol will make life work different than the way it works. And so if I can't change that, then I need to grow in my acceptance of life on life's terms, even when they stink. Courage to change the things I can. I need courage. One writer said that courage means to be of a battle-ready mind, to be vigorous. It is an action word. It's to be spiritually vigilant, poised, ready to spring into action. It is a quality that enables a person to face danger and difficulty with firmness and without fear or depression. And a lot of us know a lot about the fear and depression piece. I need that kind of courage. I needed that kind of courage when I got the call about my brother. some years later, my mother. And later on, my stepdad who raised me. My great-nephew. I had a business failure when I was 15 years sober. My wife and I lost absolutely everything. Had a $126 car payment, and my choice was to make the car payment or buy groceries. So I took the car down to the dealer and said, I can't make the payment. I just gave it back to him. My wife had never had to work outside the home at that time, and we found ourselves on a graveyard shift at a cannery, $4.24 an hour. That first night, I can't tell you how many strawberries I saw. And then it was cherries. Then we went to another cannery and carrots and corn and we had some friends after I'd taken our car back to the dealership, came over to our house and they said, we've been praying for you guys and we think God wants us to buy you a car. Their names were Rich and Mary. He said, we've got $600. Rich and I drove around Salem looking for a $600 car and couldn't find anything on the lots. We were driving down the street in Salem, and in front of this house was a 73 Plymouth Valiant with a for sale sign that said inquire within, and knocked on the door, and man came out and said, how much you want for your Plymouth? He said $650. And well, it needed tires. You could see the steel cord. They were really, really bad. I said, well, we'll give you $400 for it. And he said, no, it's worth more than that. So I put my name and number on a piece of paper. I said, well, if you change your mind, give me a call. And a couple of days later, the guy called and said, you still interested in that Plymouth? And I said, yeah. How much you want for it? And he said, $450. I said, $430. And he says, okay. So I called Rich and we went over and he picked me up and we went over and paid for the car and went directly to Les Schwab's, and we found a set of inexpensive radials for $169.95. Had 5 cents left out of that $600. And we drove that car for 6 years. And I sold it for $650. But that first Christmas was the first Christmas in our teenage daughter's lives that they didn't get a Christmas gift. By the time we paid rent and just the basics, there wasn't anything extra. And we sat down for a Christmas meal, and I was going to pray and ask God to bless the meal, and I got really emotional. And my daughters came behind me, and they put their hands on my shoulders and back, and they prayed for me. And they said things like, well, Dad, we don't need presents. Look at all we have. And I realized that some of these spiritual things that I'd been gaining in the rooms of AA and the church I was part of at that time were in my daughter's lives. We've had many, many Christmases together. And I couldn't tell you the details of any of them except that one. And every Christmas, we're either together Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, and we talk about that Christmas with good memories. But I needed courage to go through that place. It was really difficult. Pride and ego just got slammed. There's another word that has courage within it. Discouraged. I feel so discouraged. I feel so discouraged. We think it, we say it. What the word means is lack of courage. So if we find ourselves thinking or saying it, that means that life has placed something on our path that is really difficult, and I lack the courage to go through it. I want to run, want to use, drink, something, rather than just going through that difficult place. That's a great time to talk to your higher power. The word encourage means to fill with courage. And the God of my understanding is encouraging God in all those different places of the journey when I've said I feel discouraged, and I've prayed, and that I've been encouraged to go through the places. Oftentimes we get discouraged and begin to feel defeated. I'm losing again. This was not in my plan. Won't things ever work out right? Those kind of thoughts. And from there, it's real easy to slip right into that place of depression. Wake up in the morning and think, I don't want to go out and do life today. I don't want to see anybody, do anything. Or then in the event of getting up and go outside, maybe it's a beautiful morning, the sky's blue, the sun's shining, birds are singing, everything seems great because of that depression that is there. And then it gets a little bit darker. In a place of despair, thoughts will come like, maybe life isn't going to work for me. Maybe it's not in the cards. Maybe I'm so flawed as a human being it just isn't possible. In a place of despair, there might be a little bit of light. In a place of despondency, the light goes out. I can't tell you the number of people I've heard say this. I feel so hopeless. The last year or so, I drank alcohol. That's where I lived. Alcohol was no longer working like it had in the beginning. I desperately tried to get it to, but it just wasn't working. And at this time, Patsy and I lived outside of Coos Bay, 10, 11 miles, a little community called Green Acres. It was some acreages, a service station, grocery store, that's about it. And we were renting a house out there, and it was a Friday, and I had something to do in Coos Bay. I left home that morning and drove in, did what I needed to do, and I'd promised Patsy I'd be home in time for dinner. And so I took care of my business, and I looked at my watch and thought, well, I'll stop and have a couple beers, play a game of pool. I'll get home in time for dinner. It was still morning hours. Something I've learned since being in recovery is that when I put that much alcohol in me, it changes the way I think. Because after 2 beers, my mind said, you better have another one. Better have another one. Better have another one. Drank through the morning, afternoon, in the evening. Remember sitting on a bar stool that night looking at my watch thinking, well, I'll just keep drinking till I know she's in bed asleep. Big yellow streak down my back. Ended up closing up the bars, went home, got home somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning. Patsy was angry, disappointed. I was angry at myself. I was disappointed in myself because when I left home, that was not my intention. Another broken promise. I went to bed, and while I was lying in bed, I began to cry. And that crying turned into almost convulsive sobs that just welled up out of the deepest part of me. And in the midst of that, I said a prayer to the God I'd been introduced to by my grandma when I was 5 years old. When I was 10, my grandma had a stroke. She was in a coma 3 weeks. She died. People in the church told me God took her. That gave me a terrible image of who God is. And at age 10, I slammed that door shut. But 21 years later, I'm lying in bed, looking at my life, and I'm praying. I woke up later that morning, and when I woke up, I'd forgotten the prayer, I'd forgotten the crying. My first thought was to go back into Coos Bay and start drinking again. The fire got started the night before. When I woke up, it wanted to be fed. But I had a little bit of business to take care of first. Our landlord lived about an eighth of a mile up this little country road from us, and every month I'd carry the rent money over to him. I'd say, "Hi, Frank." He'd say, "Hi, Gary." I'd give him the rent, give him a receipt. "See you later." Our conversation never went beyond that. And this morning I'm walking to Frank's house, and I'm playing with a couple lies in my mind because I want to ask him to take a half a month's rent. Because when I go into Coos Bay to drink, I want this money. And so I'm kind of listening to these lies, and I approach his property. He happened to be in his front yard. And I got pretty close to him, and that morning our conversation changed. He looked at me, and he pointed his finger at me. He got this gruff look on his face. He said, "Are you having a problem with the jug?" Just like that. Before I could think, I said, "Yes." I never wanted to take a word back so much in all my life, but it just popped out. He said, "I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I haven't had to take a drink in over 10 years. Would you like to go to a meeting?" And I lied to him. I said, "Yes," again. I had never heard of AA. I didn't know a thing about it. He said, "There's a meeting tonight. I'll pick you up at 7:30. And on the way home, I'm wondering, what in the world have I just done to myself?" And when I got home, I told Patsy what had happened. She didn't really respond. She was still angry. She was still disappointed. But there was another piece for her, too. She was afraid to hope. I'd had so many false starts at trying to get sober that she didn't want to hope because it hurt too bad when I'd go on another run. And all afternoon I thought about calling Frank and canceling, but something inside was saying, "Check it out." And he picked me up and took me to that meeting. I was full of anxiety. I had no idea what to expect. And in that particular meeting, the chairs were set up theater style like this, and there was a desk up front, and the chairperson sat behind the desk. And that night, the chairperson was a beat up, broken up, retired logger. Been in logging accidents, car accidents. He kind of walked around like this, and his nickname was Speed. And Speed was chairing the meeting that night, and I'll never forget it. He asked a question, "Is there anyone here for their first, second, or third AA meeting? If so, would you give us your first name?" And I'm in the back row and said, "My name's Gary." And Speed looked across the room and he said, "Gary, you're the most important person in this room tonight. Glad you're here. Hope you hear something to make you want to come back." I felt like the least important person in the whole world that night. And here's a stranger looking at me and saying, "I have value." In that particular meeting, when someone new came in, they had what they call a first step meeting, and they shared what it was like, what happened, what their life was like now. And throughout that meeting, I heard stories of miracles in people's lives. People who had been right where I was that night, they were no longer there. Stories of faith, stories of courage, stories of hope. In fact, as I was sitting in that meeting listening to all these guys, I thought they'd been talking to my wife because they seemed to know an awful lot about me. But I left that meeting with something that had not been in my life for a long, long time. Hope. A little bit of hope. Maybe there's a chance for me. This is from a book titled Hope Rising. Sometimes it is only through devastation that we find the truth. Hardship can be like a savage cleansing fire. All the things we think of as necessary to our survival are soon revealed as nothing more than the dross of complacent luxury, consumed by the fire as it burns down to the true metal of the soul. Hardship uncovers the only thing we truly need to survive: hope. Within every heart there exists a special place, a place where the hopes and dreams of the soul soar, unchained by logical or physical entrapments. For some, visiting this unique place is a frivolous waste of time, a mental blowing of dandelion spores. For others, this place becomes a mountain meadow within their soul. The sweeping expanse of wildflowers and fragrant grasses, the streams of pure glacial water where the spirit runs free. It is a place where the impossible flourishes, where dreams survive the inferno of reality to become the miraculous wonders that draw us forward. It is a place where hope rises. Left that meeting with a little bit of hope, and then got on what we call the emotional roller coaster. One moment I'm up in the clouds wondering, why did I ever drink? And in an instant, I'd be thinking suicide. The last year I drank, there was a thought that would roll through my mind at times. I wonder what it would be like to be dead. And it would just replay itself over and over. Scared Patsy because I'd go in the bedroom at home during the day and I'd pace the floor. I'd close the door and I'd pace the floor back and forth, hour, 2 hours. Is this ever going to get better? And I thought my mind was going to explode. I'd been given a big book and I'd try to read, and I'd read a paragraph over and over and over again. Couldn't pull words off the page. Go to a meeting, get a little bit of a respite, and then it was this up and down and around, difficult sleeping. And that went on for 3.5 weeks, and I woke up one morning and decided to drink again. I went into Coos Bay, started drinking early in the day. I had never been kicked out of a bar in my life, and I was asked to leave too that day. Became a nasty-mouthed, belligerent, obnoxious drunk. Ended up in a place called Deb's Club, downtown North Bend. It was 10:15 at night. I was sitting on a bar stool. I can still see that clock. And I made a decision. On the way home tonight, I'm going to get the old station wagon going as fast as it'll go. I'm finding a post, guardrail, something. I'm checking out. I don't want to do this anymore. Drinking doesn't work. Not drinking doesn't work. What's the point? What's the point? Ended up closing up Deb's Club. It was a downstairs bar. I began walking up the steps. The next thing I recall, I was going through the back door of our house, 11, 12 miles away. No memory of that drive at all. Blackout. Not uncommon. Many mornings I'd wake up in bed and wonder how I got home, and the car would be in the driveway. Sometimes it was parked a little funny, but it'd be there. Driven hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles with no memory. And Patsy was absolutely crushed. And when I woke up later that morning, the war began. Go back to AA, go finish the job. Go back to AA, go finish the job. And all day long, that was bouncing back and forth in my mind. When I left home that evening, I told Patsy I'm going to give AA another try, but part of me was thinking, as soon as I get into Coos Bay, I'm going to get as drunk as I can possibly get. I'm getting this over with. I'm just tired. And I drove into Coos Bay and actually parked in front of the AA meeting place and sat in the car trying to decide whether to go in or not. There was a tavern about 1.5 blocks away where I'd done a lot of drinking. And I thought, well, I'll go over there. I'll go in there. Go over there, in there. And it was in that struggle I saw the insanity of this disease in a way I'd never seen it. In 3.5 weeks of meetings, I'd heard all these stories of miracles in people's lives. And over here was death and heartache for people who loved me. A sane person wouldn't struggle with that. You ask 100 people, I'm giving you two choices, life or death. That person will not say, well, let me think about that. They will immediately choose life. I'm thinking about it. And I saw the insanity of that. And I said a prayer. I said, God, give me the strength to go into that AA meeting. And I opened the door and walked into the beginning of a new life that night. And what happened is described in chapter 3 of the big book. It says the idea that somehow, someday he will control and enjoy his drinking is the great obsession of every abnormal drinker. The persistence of this illusion is astonishing. Many pursue it into the gates of insanity or death. We learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic. This is the first step in recovery. The delusion that we are like others, or presently may be, has to be smashed. And for me, that idea, that great obsession that I'd had for those 16 years, that somehow alcohol was going to work like it had in the beginning, that idea was absolutely smashed. And I knew that night the issue is no longer about drinking or not drinking. It's about how do I learn to live sober? Because I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. And the people in the rooms of AA began teaching me this sober way of life, the spiritual way of life. Courage to change the things I can. I cannot change the past. I can't change other people. I can't change the way life works. What I can do is I can begin working on those things I identified with the first line of the prayer, my resentments and my anger and my self-pity and the victim role and all those kinds of things. I can begin working on those one day at a time. But there's something else I can work on that will profoundly affect my interaction with this thing we call life. You ever get up in the morning with a crummy attitude and kind of share it with others as you go through the day? When my attitude is right, life seems right. When my attitude stinks, guess what? So does life. But I'm responsible for the attitude I carry through the day. No one else is. And there's a guy named Chuck Swindoll wrote this piece on attitude many years ago. Maybe some of you have come across it. There's a lot of wisdom in it. He writes, the longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude to me is more important than facts. It is more important than the past, than education, than money, than circumstances, than failures, than successes, than what other people think or say or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we will embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play on the one string we have, and that is attitude. I am convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% how I react to it. I had that backwards for a long time. And so it is with you. We are in charge of our attitudes. And wisdom to know the difference. I need wisdom. One writer said, wisdom is the art of being successful at forming the correct plan to gain the desired results. And when he was writing about success, he wasn't writing about success as far as money and property, prestige, and those kinds of things. He was writing about successful at living, navigating through this thing we call life. Successful in relationships. Successful in having integrity and honesty and those kinds of things. And he says we have to have a plan. forming the correct plan to gain the desired results. Well, fortunately for us in recovery, the plan's in place. I don't have to come up with a plan. There's a plan called the 12 steps. If I align my life with the principles within those steps, the results, I'll be pleased with the results. But I need wisdom. In my belief system, wisdom is always connected to truth. What I know, what I think, what I believe might not be the truth. There's a bumper sticker that says, don't believe everything you think. Good advice for some of us. There was a day people said, buddy, you take your boat out there too far, you're going right off the edge. People really believed that. And there was a day people said, those Wright brothers, they are wacko. They think they're going to put something together that's actually going to fly. Impossible, never happened. And there was a day people said, there's no way we'll ever put a man on the moon. So many things that we come to believe later on, we find they're not true at all. But as I said, wisdom to me is always connected to truth. Wisdom tells me I can't change the past. Wisdom tells me I cannot change other people. Wisdom tells me I can't make life work different than the way it works. Wisdom tells me if I don't take the first drink, I'll never get drunk. That's the truth. You can take that to the bank. Absolute truth. That confused me when I first got sober. They talked about don't take the first drink, and I think, well, how's one drink? What is one drink going to do? And then someone explained, if you get hit by a train, it's not the caboose that kills you. But wisdom tells me if I don't take the first drink, I'll never get drunk. Wisdom tells me if I forgive someone who has offended me in some way, I will experience freedom. Wisdom tells me that if I will align my life to the principles within the 12 steps, I'll have some of this thing we call serenity and peace. And life will look different. Come up out of that darkness that this disease causes in our lives. And every day I can be a seeker of wisdom. I love to go to AA meetings and listen. I never know when someone might say something that'll just, wow, it'll just resonate on the inside, and I'll know that's the real deal. Sometimes it's from a newcomer. Sometimes it's from a newcomer, someone who's just barely been around, and they'll say something that's just profound. But if I'm not with that person at that meeting, I lose out. And to me, that's why the community is so valuable, the recovery community. I can't learn anything from me. All I know is what I know. And if I want to know more than what I know, I need to be with people who can teach me. I heard a young man say one time, he said, the people in the rooms of AA have been my professors. And I would say that same thing. Teaching me things I didn't know. And that process just continues. If I gave each of you a wooden match tonight and said, okay, your job tonight is to break this match, all of you would just snap it. But if I gave you a whole handful of wooden matches bound tightly together and said, break this, that'd be a different story. And to me, that's community. I always see myself as a match right in the middle, all that support. But if I'm not in that community, I'm like this single wooden match out here trying to navigate through all this stuff of life by myself. And when life happens, and if I don't have that support and all that stuff around me, over I go. And no one has it all. There's a lot of wisdom in this room right here. a lot of experience in this room. And a peace that you have may benefit someone else. And it just works that way. So I need to be in community. I didn't feel that way in the beginning. In the beginning, I thought, you mean I'm going to have to go to these stupid AA meetings for the rest of my life? And that was those are the kind of thoughts I had. But somewhere along that line, that shifted to, I have to go to these meetings, to, I get to go to these meetings. I don't have to recover. I get to recover. That was a major shift. And then I went to meetings because I wanted to be at meetings. And when I wanted to be there, they looked completely different than when I didn't want to be there. So, as I said in the beginning, I believe everyone journeying through life wants to find some peace. And there's some principles within this prayer that can help us to find that. But the giants aren't out there, they're in here. I need to go inside, get honest with myself, and say, what are my giants? What are the things within me that are the blocks for me finding this thing called serenity? This is a great prayer. It's really a great prayer. And have a couple minutes for any questions or comments. I really appreciate your attentiveness. I hope this has been helpful. Anyone? Yes.
I really appreciated what you emphasized several times about how we have value. Each and every person has value.
Yeah.
And I think if people really take your advice about even standing in front of the mirror and forgiving themselves and even emphasizing that they have value, I think that was really good.
Yeah.
Appreciate that.
Everyone here has tremendous value. That's the truth. In fact, you have so much value that never, ever, ever in all of eternity will you be replaced. There will never be another one just exactly like you. That's how much value your higher power places on who you are. Anyway, that's what I believe. Again, I appreciate your attentiveness. You can have one of these handouts. Take one and pass it on. And I really appreciate you letting me be here to share these things that are important to me. Thank you.